Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. There are visual effects that you can only achieve through rotoscoping. And in the case of this sequence, since there's very little to key, roto is the only option if you want to turn the original footage into something like this, where a Z-depth matte is made using roto, and that's then used as the depth map layer in After Effects on an instance of the lens blur effect. A couple of other effects that you can achieve using roto are day for night, where the brightness and color of the various elements can be controlled individually. And one of the best uses of roto is to incorporate CG elements behind foreground live action elements, as in this example. For the most part, the audio for these tutorials was recorded after I captured the video for my screen. Recording the audio after the video, that allows me to scrub quickly through the repetitive parts of the roto process. So sometimes the video is playing back at up to 3 times actual speed. That's also why sometimes there are 2 different cursors on the screen. The conventional arrow cursor is the one that was recorded during the initial video screen grab, and the orange circle, or sometimes it's a semicircle, was recorded during my audio voiceover. Also, my computer allows the keyboard keys I hit to be seen at the bottom of the screen. These are all Mac keyboard keys, so I'll just point out some important Windows equivalents. Command is Control. This is the Option symbol, and it's the same as Alt on a PC. And this symbol means Shift, which, by the way, is only displayed if it's pressed along with another key. Here are a few more symbols that appear on the screen throughout this tutorial. I've got the up, down, left, right arrow keys, page up and page down, home, end, delete and backspace, enter, return, tab, and the numbers and math symbols on the numeric keypad are displayed with the word pad before the number or symbol to differentiate them from those that are above the letter keys. Also, when I click the mouse, a small red circle is displayed for as long as the mouse is clicked, and double clicking is shown with a double circle. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. I'd like to go over the basics of rotoscoping in After Effects before we get into the more detailed stuff, and so I'll just show you how I set up a roto project. So the first thing to do is, once you've imported your footage, to create a solid above, which you turn off, and the layer below, the footage layer, you lock. I also have been getting in the habit of creating an expression, 960. Whoops, it's supposed to be a comma. Okay, so now it can't actually move. I can't accidentally move this. It's effectively locked the position. Because if this shifts at all while you're rotoscoping, it can screw everything up and you have to start over. Okay, so on the white solid, I'm going to make a roto shape around this window, for example. And notice that I'm now in the pen tool. I want to be in the selection tool, which is this one here. I also just hit V to switch to it. Hold down the hand, and I start refining my shape. I want this to come right out to the edge of this black rim, and at the top, that to go there, and this to go here. This point is linear. I would make all my points linear, and then I tend to adjust them at the end to Bezier. And the way I do that is by holding down Option Command, which is Alt Control on a PC, and clicking on it and it's pretty close to where I want it to be. This one I need to adjust it a little bit. If, for example, I had a path over here, pardon me, a vertice over here that I wanted to move in here, in order to fix it so that it would conform to this arc, I make it linear and then make it Bezier again, like that. So that's something I often do when if I'm moving points around along a line. If it's not quite positioned right and I have to move it in, for example, from here to here, I'll just double click it like that. Okay, so when you're rotoscoping, always rotoscope on a layer above, which is a solid, and make sure that your footage is locked underneath, and preferably with an expression on your position to really ensure that it's not going to be moved at all. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Preserve constant vertex count when editing masks. You have to make sure that that's turned on, because if it's turned off, all hell breaks loose and you get errors if you start to make anything vaguely resembling a complicated mask shape. So even if your shape is simple, if you have a shape that's simple, let me just make a shape again here. Hit the letter G to bring up the pen tool. If you have a mask shape that's simple like this that later becomes complex, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of extra points that will also be included in this simple shape. I'm going to hit V to go back to the selection tool so that I can add points. Actually, I should give an example of that right now. To add a point, you hold down Option Command, Alt Control on a PC. So I can add a point in like that, which is a linear point in between the two. I can also delete it like this. If I click, I can pull out Bezier handles if I need them. I tend not to do that until I've finished up the whole shape. I'm going to delete that point again. Once you've made your shape, there's a couple of things you should get in the habit of doing. What's happened to me a few times is I'll have a shape and I'll start rotoscoping. Okay, let's see here. So let's say I need to move it along. I'm holding down Option here to select all points, by the way, and I want to move it there. And then I go back to the original frame and I realize, oh, I don't have keyframing on. So once you make your mask, I'll just hit M so you can see the mask. There's the mask. I'll delete this one just to show you the routine you should try to get into. You click to create the mask like this. As soon as you close the mask, hit Shift Option M, and that sets a keyframe. That's a really good habit to get into. If you do that, as soon as you close a mask, if you hit Shift Option M, that's Shift Alt M on a PC, then you're going to end up with a keyframe on your rotoshape, so it's ready. So it's going to change over time. If I go to the end here, I'll hit V to go back to the selection tool. I can move it along. Of course, all this jitter that you see in here is going to be gone in the way that we're going to rotoscope in this DVD, which is by using tracking. So I'll get rid of this point. This one too, we don't need it because that's just to demonstrate. One thing I tend to avoid doing if I have handles, once I've created it like this, there's, for example, a little, let me see if I can find a better example, maybe around here. If I make a shape here. Whoops, yeah, that'll do. Let's see, I'm rotoscoping this thing out here. Whoops. Got to switch to the selection tool by hitting V. When I create a Bezier handle by hitting Control Option here, and let's say in here, create a new point. I'd rather not change these handles too much. I'd rather leave them at their default state that they end up at, because if you start messing with these, you can get a lot of chatter from keyframe to keyframe. So I'll just leave these as they are, and I would rather just make an in-between point than mess around with those handles. Some people don't do it that way. It seems to work well for me. So instead of trying to shape this in here like this, I'll just add a new point in there. See if I can place this well here. Yeah. So for example here as well, down in here, instead of turning this down like that to deal with this little gap here, I'll just make a new point like that and adjust this one, because now it's gone off. So if I command option click it twice, it resets it. And that's the basic rotoscoping technique that I use to do Bezier style roto. One of the handy things about After Effects is that you can use the arrow keys to move points around. If you need to finesse stuff, I'm just holding down the arrow keys, the left and right arrow keys, and you can go up and down. You can hold down shift if you want to go in bigger increments. So that's a really important thing to do when you're rotoscoping, because you can get a pretty sore hand by gripping the mouse or the Wacom pen for too long. I use a mouse, by the way. I can't seem to use a Wacom tablet, although it seems to be most people do. Alright, so I want to also cover option clicking to select all. I think I already mentioned that actually. But if you double click a roto shape, you can move it around. You can scale it independent. You can also move the anchor point so that it'll scale around a certain part. So this area here is not scaling at all. You can rotate it. This is the anchor point up here that everything rotates around. You can also, when you're using the transform box, sometimes you want to just grab a selection of points, which you can't do with a layer turned off. You want to just grab a selection of points to transform. But if you turn the layer on and you turn the mask opacity to 0 and then select the mask, you can then select a portion of the points. Now I've only got these points selected, and I can put a transform box around them if I just want to move just a portion of the full shape of points. And again, this anchor point can be used to scale. The more you can do using transform boxes, the better to get your roto shape to conform to whatever element of your footage you're trying to roto. Because since they're all moving together, they tend to move more smoothly. If I try to move these individual points, let's say from here to here, if I try to move the individual points into place, then I'm going to end up getting chatter. So it's always better to use a transform box. Let's see if I can find a more extreme example. By the time I get to the end here, notice I'm clicking option to select all the points. See how it's kind of shifted here? It's gotten a bit wider than on the first frame. But this is different down below here. It seems to be better on this side and worse on this side, and the opposite is true up here. So if I select all the points at the top here and double click, I could say that, well, this looks good over here, and I can pull these out to make them fit. And this one up. And I'm still not on perfectly, so I can just do that last little, that last little finessing. But like I was saying, the less of this you have to do and the more you can use the transform box, the better. So that's a few extra tips for rotoscoping in After Effects. So we'll get on to the tracking-based roto tutorial. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. I'd like to explain why I leave the solid visibility off rather than just turning its opacity to 0. If I load this into RAM, you can see it's being loaded in by the green line here. Yeah. And I want to adjust points, let's see, with my arrow keys here. Notice I haven't lost my RAM preview at all. So if I go somewhere else, I move things around, I'm not losing my RAM preview. Whereas if I turn my layer on, notice the RAM preview is gone. And unfortunately, even though my mask opacity is at 0, if I load everything into RAM, since my layer is on, even though there's not actually any pixel change on the screen, if I change something here, I lose my whole RAM preview. See? So I lost it. Just making a change anywhere causes the whole RAM preview to go away. So I've got it back and I change one little point. And I've lost all my RAM previews. So that's why in almost all cases, except when I really need, when it's more important that I move points together, I'd rather try to save my RAM preview as much as possible. Let's say I have all these points up here that I need to move as a group. You can transform the whole box together, but if you only need to get a few of these points, you can always click and then shift click to add the points you need, the extra points. So if you could do it that way. And in so doing, you don't lose your RAM preview, so you can work a lot faster. You can go even faster than real time with the very good RAM preview scrubbing you can do. So I just thought I'd mention that. It's very important to keep this layer off as much as possible to use the RAM preview to its advantage. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Tracking plays an important part in rotoscoping, so I'm going to go over a few of the basics before we delve too deeply into rotoscoping this footage. So, first thing you need to do is set your workspace to motion tracking, which will bring up this panel. Make sure you can see it all the way down. Sometimes it's a bit hidden, that you can see all the controls right down to this word apply. And if you have nothing selected, you can't track motion. You have to actually choose a layer and then click track motion. And what that does is it gives you a track point. I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit, and I'm going to track a point over here. Holding down Command allows me to make the box any size I want if I don't hold down Command or Control on a PC. This box expands on both sides, so Command allows you to just move one corner at a time. I'm choosing here to include this little indent in the feature region because the more complex this shape is and the more high contrast, the better for motion tracking. So now we're just going to click the Analyze button and it should go pretty fast. So there you go. I have analyzed these 9 frames very quickly. And to do a shot like this, to properly rotoscope a shot like this, if you want to do the whole thing, as we're going to be doing here, you need a good 30, 40, possibly 50 tracker points. And it sounds like a lot, but it's a lot less tedious to set up some good tracker points than it is to try to rotoscope the whole thing without using tracker points. So I'm going to make another track point here, just to demonstrate a couple of other important aspects of tracking. Now I'm making my track feature region, which is this region in here, quite a bit bigger, and I'm also making the search area quite a bit bigger. So I'm on frame 1. If I click apply, notice it's going quite a bit slower. That's because it's got a bigger region that it needs to search to find a match for this image. So those are pretty easy track points. I'm going to do a little bit trickier track point now, which is going to be this. Whoops. This sphere here. So track motion brings a track point in beside it. Make this a bit bigger so that it fits the sphere correctly. And one thing to note, magnify feature when dragging. That's on by default, and I find it very confusing. You see how it lights that up, or it magnifies that? But here we have the plus sign, which corresponds to the attach point, which is the important data. This is really what we're concerned with, is all the information contained in this plus sign. When you grab the box in the center and move it around, notice it's an X here. It's not the same. This is the actual center. This is the actual center of the feature region, and this is the attach point, which are two different things. Notice here it's in the center, even though it's offset up here. This is the important thing to be concerned with. I recommend you turn magnify feature when dragging off, and if you want to see more detail, you just zoom in. That way, see, when I click, it doesn't magnify it. The reason I'm going to move this to the top rather than leaving it in the center of the sphere is that I'll be able to judge better if my track is hanging on, if I have it close to an edge, so I can see if there's any chatter. So now I'm going to track this and see what happens. Oh, something bad happened there in the middle, because his arm goes in front and it can't track that. It seems to have hung on well on this frame even, which is good, but it lost it here and it got all wonky in the end. And it's always looking for that sphere. Now it found it finally in the end there. But what we're going to do to fix that is just go back to the last good frame, which is here, and offset. I'm going to offset my feature region and search area. And the way to do that in After Effects is to hold down Option, Alt on a PC, and I'm going to choose maybe this. So now it's going to remember that offset. Let's see if I can do a frame or two here. Now that my feature region is available again, the original item that I was tracking, I'm going to hold down Option again and move it back to where I want it to be to do the last couple frames. Notice I'm not clicking forward with the forward button here. I'm actually clicking frame by frame. And even though there's that offset, have a look at the little plus sign here. It stays up top there. Okay? That's how the offset works. The offset only changes the box position, but not the position of the attach point when you hold down Option. So that's something to be aware of when you're motion tracking. I also want to do a really difficult track point now. Let's say something like that's almost impossible to track because it's just too blurry, like his pinky here. So there it is. Track motion, make it raw, because raw just means you're just collecting data, which is all we're really doing here. Okay, with a track point like this, it's just not going to track. It's going to be very, very difficult for After Effects to figure out from frame to frame what's going on. because it changes so much, but you know visually where it's supposed to be. So there's nothing stopping you from just... Okay, I've got a couple little track points in there, which we'll have a look at down here. See, I'm gathering all my tracker data. This attach point, I'm just going to move it to where I know it's supposed to be. So there's frame 1, frame 2. And even though this is a little bit tedious, it's not nearly as tedious as trying to rotoscope the whole thing. If you can get these points, if you can get a few good track points to help you along the way, they're going to push all of your points roughly into position. So this is just one point rather than trying to move 20 rotoshape points all into position from frame to frame. So, whoops. Notice I've completely left behind my search region because it's really not important. The really important part of the calculation is this plus sign. That's the only thing that all of the calculations that After Effects makes are based on. I think I'm way past here. Oh yeah, I've gone off. Okay. So I actually was tracking further on here. More frames than I actually needed to. Okay, so now I've got a track point which I've done by hand, which is also a handy thing when sometimes you have something obscured like this sphere was. You can just manually place it where it's supposed to be. Okay, so that's 4 different kinds of track points with a couple of little problems you can run into. And we're going to be using this kind of motion tracking as the basis for all of our rotoscoping, because if you create a bunch of track points, that takes all of that little chatter out of your rotoscoping that normally happens if you've ever tried to do just straight roto of something. There's always a little jiggle to it, and this kind of motion tracking is going to ensure that that stuff is kept to a minimum. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. In this tutorial, I'm going to demonstrate how I set up a tracking comp. So I have my footage here, which I've brought into a comp by dragging onto the Make New Comp button. And I'm going to rename that to Trackers. Put it in a folder. And the comp called Trackers, I'm going to make a comp from the comp. And the comp that I'm making is I'm going to change its name to Track This Comp. So this one called Track This Comp is what's going to appear in the layer window. And the comp that's within this comp, which is now called Trackers, I'm actually going to change that name to Trackers CC, which is Trackers Color Correction. So any color correction I apply to the footage which is within this comp, the comp called Track This Comp is just going to see that as pixel values. So I can do extreme color correction in order to get better track points, because I'm using luminance when I'm tracking. So the more contrast I can make between elements of my search region and feature region, the better. Okay. So, for example, you can look at the different channels. Here we're looking at the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. Looks like the blue channel has pretty good contrast for tracking. So you could use a shift channels effect to isolate the blue channel, which we're going to be doing as we need to when we're collecting all of our tracking points. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. So I'm going to track a few points here, just to go over the motion tracking aspect of this roto tutorial again. So I'll create a track point here. I'm making it raw, just because I'm actually only collecting the data. I don't need to transform or stabilize anything at the moment. So I set it up and click the Analyze button, which is over here. And I haven't used the color correction yet that I did in the previous tutorial, but I'm going to do that for my next point. A little bit more difficult point here. This is his shoulder. And I'm also looking here for the best contrast. So I kind of decide red, green looks good. So I'm going to go green, green, green for my shift channels so that I can actually track the green. There. Which has pretty good contrast. So it's not going to be a perfect track, but even a so-so track is okay because it just moves around so much. A bit of this I'm going to have to hand track. But I seem to be tracking it okay here. Moving along. Alright, so that's a track point for the shoulder. Now the same for the hand. I'm going to try and track this hand. It's slipping all over the place. But that's okay. You can always move that little X. Pardon me, not the X. The plus sign. The plus sign is what you want to be concerned with. And I recommend you turn off this magnification. Okay, so not tracking like the greatest, but it has to be sometimes done by hand. Moving this one point will save you having to move all those little points in your roto shape. If you can just get this one point, pretty good. Okay, and it's skipping off here, so I'll just have to hand track that most likely. Okay, so now I've got a pretty good track for the front of the arm and for the back of the arm. And here's just a little example of the collection of track points that I'm gathering. There's going to be a few more, some on the statue here, some back here possibly, that I'll need to track this whole piece of footage. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. In this tutorial, I'm going to be demonstrating how I rotoscope this scene. I'm going to do every feature in this scene, the skateboarder and all the buildings and elements of it. The first thing I'm going to do is the statue here. I'm going to rotoscope that, and to do that I need to create a track point, because all of my rotoscoping is based on first creating a 2-point track. And to do that, you have to make sure you have your tracker controls open here. Click, in this case it could be either stabilize or track motion. It doesn't really matter because we're going to be just using the data that we gather afterwards. So there's my track point. I'm going to bring it over to a nice high contrast area of the statue. When I'm moving these corner points, I hold down Command, otherwise the entire box expands. So that looks like it's tracking pretty well. So here I'm clicking on the forward button, by the way, going from frame 1 to frame 40. Sometimes I will hit escape if I see there's a significant change in the way the feature looks. I'll hit escape to stop and start to reset the image that it's using as its basis for tracking. Okay, let's see. Yeah, that looks good. I need to create a second track point. I'll just go back here a little bit. In this one, I just clicked on track motion, and I'm going to choose raw because really I'm just collecting the data now, and I'm going to later apply it into one tracker. But I like to do one track point at a time so I can pay good attention to it. So there's the second track point. I'm going to move it up to a feature up near the top here. This is what's going to give us the scaling and perspective shift, or the scaling and rotation shift rather. So that looks like a feature that'll track well. Now down here, there's a bit of a shift in color when we come up to this beige band along the brick. So I'm going to move the bottom of the feature region up a little bit to make sure it doesn't catch that. And you can just stop on any frame and move it out of the way. Making sure, of course, not to move the entire box. You don't want to do that because that's going to screw up your track. Okay, so now I have two track points, and I need to apply them to the plate so that the statue gets stabilized. So I have, notice here, I'll go back a little bit here. I have two trackers. Tracker 1 has something called track point 1 in it. Tracker 2 also has a track point, which I renamed to track point 2. I command X and command V so that I can put tracker 2 into tracker 1. So there are my 2 points within tracker 1. Notice I'm on frame 1. You have to make sure you're at the first frame when you copy and paste, otherwise the track points will get offset. Okay, so I click here on rotation and scale to make sure that those get included in the calculation, and apply to both X and Y. And we end up with a plate that's kind of getting a little skewed, but this is stationary, so that's going to make our rotoscoping a lot easier. And that's what we're going to learn about in the next tutorial. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Now that we've stabilized the plate, just review this one more time. This statue's pretty much stationary. There's a little bit of parallax shift, but that's about it. I'll have a look at it now. There's a little bit of parallax shift, but we won't need too many keyframes in order to rotoscope this, so let's get to it. I'm going to make a new solid. Doesn't matter what color it is, just has to be the same size as the footage. So there's a couple things I do when I set up my rotoscoping. I always roto on a solid above the footage I'm working on. I lock the footage so I don't inadvertently shift it. I'm going to get started with just fleshing out the general shape of the footage, not the footage, the element. So I'm not doing every single little detail at the moment now. I'm just kind of filling in the basic things I need. I'll just scrub through this a little bit faster because it can be a little bit, not the most exciting thing perhaps. For some, I kind of like rotoscoping. So in most cases, I'm just, while I have the select tool in use, the one that looks like the little arrow, if I hold down Command Control on a PC, I can create a new point along the path. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just adding in a bunch of new points, most of which are just linear points. Every point you create is linear unless you pull out the handles. So just create a new point along wherever I need it to be. Notice here I'm creating a point as close to where, if you would swing this portion of the roto shape over, it would fit there. So I create my point here, and then I pull it over to its closest spot. I always try to create roto points close to the point, as close as possible to the point I'm bringing them into. That avoids sometimes some unexpected little wiggles that you get in your roto if you're not doing that. So I need to keep adding in a bunch of little points. I'll just scrub through this a bit quicker, making a bunch of little points in here. Now, yeah. Notice what I did here. On this point, I created a new point, I brought it up, and then I clicked Command Option, which would be Control Alt on a PC, and that made it Bezier. So that gave it handles there. Made it curvy and soft. That's kind of what I almost always do whenever I need to create a curve. I just add a new point and give it handles just like that. See? Command Option. Probably do the same here. Yeah, Command Option. Not every point needs this, but the ones that do, you just hit that keyboard combination, and it's a good way to create pretty refined roto shapes pretty quickly. Just scrub through this a bit more so we can see it a bit faster coming together. Same thing, a lot of command optioning here to curve out the organic parts of this, organic shapes of this statue. I wish I could rotoscope this fast. Alright. There's only one keyframe, so this roto shape is clinging pretty nicely to the statue without having to do a whole bunch of moving little points around. We're going to see it in just a second here once this loads into RAM. There we go. You can see it's holding up nicely. There's a little bit of a shift between the first and the last frame. If you look, for example, here, you can see it's moved off a little bit, and now we're going to address that. So, what did I do here? I have no points selected on my shape. If I hold down Option, I can select all the points. And then if I double click it, I get a transform box. Now, if you look what I've done up here, I've taken the anchor point and I moved it over to a point that is where I want it to be, and I've used that as the point around which everything rotates. So I bring that point over, and then I can curve the whole roto shape, which I want to do as much as possible. If I can move all points together, you get much less chatter. If you try to move all of these, if I try to move all of these points individually into place, I end up getting little inaccuracies between the distances I moved each one, and that can cause me problems. So I want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So I curve this down in until I get it somewhere that looks pretty close to what I'd like it to be. Although there's, of course, still some inaccuracy that we're going to have to fix afterwards. And if you look at the top, that didn't do good things for the top. So I have to employ a slightly different technique in order to get this top in shape. So what I'm going to do is turn on my solid. Now it's off, but I can't put a transform box around only a selection of the points of the mask unless my layer is on. So I'm going to do that. I'll turn on my layer and turn its opacity to 0. There's opacity at 0. Yeah. So now this is working in a slightly different way. Unfortunately, the disadvantage of working in this way with the white solid on is that I don't get to keep my RAM preview, so I can't scrub quite as fast as I otherwise would, especially if you're using 2K plates. That can be a bit of a drag because it slows things down. But at SD or HD, you probably won't have too much trouble. It is a little bit of advantage for moving for moving individual points with keyboard shortcuts and things like that, which we'll get into. So I've got my, there we go. You see how I selected just a group of points? That's why I had to turn on the white solid in order to be able to do that, because I want to move all of these points together. So there, I've shifted them. I'm going to offset my anchor point to somewhere that I like, that seems to be hugging the shape properly, and then I'm going to contract it in as best I can, like that. Okay, so I have something that's looking pretty close. And now it's just a matter of finessing those last points that seem to have strayed off. Scrub through this a little bit more. There's some funny things going on here that I need to fix up a little bit. Okay, let's have a look here, see how this looks now. Alright, so now we have a roto shape that hugs the statue quite well. And the next step in the task is to take this roto shape and invert the transformations so that the roto shape, instead of staying with this stabilized statue, actually moves along with the original footage. And we're going to do that in the next tutorial. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. So we've got a white solid and the skateboarder footage. We'll call this white solid static, and copy it. And this one we'll call it white solid exp. So this is going to take expressions to invert it back to correspond to the original plate. And that looks like this. So this skateboarder footage has all these transforms applied to it, which we applied with a position, rotation, and scale 2-point transformation, 2-point tracker transformation. And I'm just going to let the properties that I really want to see be seen here, because it's going to get a bit crowded. So Command A, Shift A, Shift P, Shift S, Shift R to bring up just those points, and do the same for the white solid EXP. Alright, so the anchor point, do that again here. The anchor point gets expressed to the position. This anchor point gets expressed to this position to invert it. And the position gets expressed to the anchor point. The scale is a little bit of a different matter. You can't just do scale like that. It doesn't work. The way I do it is I pick whip to the X value of the scale of the footage, and that gives me an expression that looks like this. This temporary item equals scale, and this temp bracket, temp here means the first and second value of the array. And in order to invert this 93, because what we really want this 93% to become is 107% or something like that, 106 point, who knows what. And the way to do that here is to say 10,000 over temp, and here 10,000 over temp, and that gives us that number that we want in order to make the scale pop back. So this is a very important part of the expression that you should take a screen grab of or just jot down. It's very essential to the to doing this transformation, inversion. Okay, so these are the three basic, in fact, pardon me, we still have to do rotation. There's a rotation here. Okay, so rotation, so these are the four basic things you have to do. It's times -1. So if it rotated 1.4 degrees clockwise, now it's going to rotate 1.4 degrees counterclockwise. Okay, so that's the full expression, so let's test it out. We need to compare it to the original skateboarder footage. So I'll drag that back down in, turn off the stabilized skateboard footage, and turn on the white solid. In fact, we don't need to turn it on, we just need to select it while it's off, and we can still see the rotor shape, and let's have a look at it. Okay, by the way, if you hit 0 on the numeric keypad, you don't get to see your rotor shape, but if you hit spacebar, you do. So that's why we weren't seeing it here, because I hit 0 originally. Pad 0, see? So we're going to see it in just a second here. We'll be able to see the rotor shape moving along with it. So there you have your rotor shape, which has expressions to add it back. The pops in color that you see here are the keyframes. So there's hardly any keyframes, as you can see on this. When it gets bright, it just kind of flickers on bright on 1 or 2 frames. There's one there. Yeah, so that's the way you do an inversion of a rotor shape to conform it back onto the original footage. And in the next tutorials, we're going to be learning about more of this 2-point tracking, which is really the essence of rotoscoping, using always a 2-point track, and we're going to apply some 2-point tracks to the skateboarder and to some other elements in the scene. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. In this tutorial, I'm going to be rotoscoping the skateboarder's right arm. And the first thing I do is make a new comp, which I'll rename to right arm. Put that in the pieces folder. It's very important to keep all this stuff as organized as possible. And then I need to go look for a couple of track points that are useful, so that this is my track this comp. And track points 9 and 8 are the ones I want to create my 2-point track from. So I'll Command C those two, and then go back into my right arm comp, which by the way, accidentally I'm going into my tracker CC comp. I'm supposed to be in my right arm comp, but it'll work just fine here. I'm going to later transfer them over to the right arm comp. So I'm Command Ving in order to bring in my 2 tracker points into the comp. And I'm going to then create a solid, which I'm going to put above and turn its visibility off. And I'm going to apply the tracker information from these track points 8 and 9 to the white solid, which, by the way, is different from the way I applied the tracker information to the statue. To the statue, I actually applied it directly to the footage, and then I inverted it in the end. In this case, I'm applying it directly to the white solid, which is a different but equally acceptable technique for applying the tracker data. It really depends on your preference. So, transform, position, rotation, and scale. This should say transform. Motion source is the skateboarder _03. And I have to edit the target and tell it explicitly that it has to go to white solid. Find my apply button, apply to X and Y, and that creates a whole bunch of keyframes in my white solid, and we'll be able to view it now to see that it is in fact scaling and rotating in accordance with the position, scale, and rotation tracker data that was applied to it. And so now we are set up to start rotoscoping on this solid layer. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. This tutorial demonstrates very clearly the advantage of tracking-based roto. So here I'm making a shape, a mask shape, on my white solid, which has position, scale, and rotation keyframes set on it. And this mask shape, without having any keyframes on it at all, is going to conform more or less to the movement of the arm based on those 2 points. I'll just scrub forward here so you can see how it moves along. I can show you in real time here. Here it is, yeah. So this is a great advantage when you're rotoscoping, to be in a situation where most of the points are already roughly where they're supposed to be. Instead of having to do all the rotation yourself, you're letting the tracker calculation that you initially made shift the scale and rotation and position of the solid, and that allows the mask shape to conform more or less to that movement. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Now it's time to add more detail into the mask shape. So the first thing you need to do is create a keyframe on the mask shape. I'm going to actually go back to frame 1 to start off at the very beginning. So you make a keyframe on the mask shape at frame 1. I'll delete that one. And I'm just going to start adding points and refining the mask shape as I go along. So holding down Command, and by the way, in After Effects 8 that's changed to Command Option in order to add points when you have the selection tool selected. So I'm going to add a point at the elbow, and if you look, the point at the elbow kind of is maintaining its relative angle to the shoulder and arm because of the 2-point track. Now we can see it's kind of slipped off here, and I'm just scrubbing through because I have everything loaded into RAM. So I'm going to start pulling points into position. The hand is going to be its own roto shape, by the way, because it's quite a bit different from the arm in many ways. Okay, and here, I'll just scrub through this a little bit quicker. So I'm just pulling all my points into position, refining the shape as I go along, with as few keyframes as possible. Here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 keyframes. I want to keep that number to a minimum, so I'm always scrubbing and looking for the worst frame in between. And whichever one that is, that's where I set my keyframe. Now I'm using the page up, page down keys to scroll through, looking for problem areas. And I alternate between that and using the J and K key to hop between my keyframes. Going to need to make a few more points in here to capture all the detail. I use a lot of J and K. I kind of switch back and forth between J and K and page up and page down. And so that's the basic shape. Now we're going to change it into a Roto-Bezier shape in order to give it a little bit more organic feel. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. I'm going to convert this shape to a Roto-Bezier mask because it's an organic shape. It's got a lot of curves in it in the arm, and well, just for fun, because I could have easily just left it as a Bezier. Sometimes it's nice to use Roto-Bezier because Roto-Bezier doesn't have any Bezier handles, so they don't get in the way. You don't accidentally bump into them, but I didn't necessarily have to use them. Have to use a Roto-Bezier. It's just to change things up a little bit. Okay, what I'm doing is I'm going through all of my keyframes, and I'm clicking on Option Command, and then pulling out one point. Since I have all points selected, all of the points are getting the same change done to them, which is that I'm just making them full, set to full curve, rather than to be fully linear. So now that I've pulled them all out, I'm going to start finessing the mask a little bit more, pulling the points in, and I'll probably be mostly going between my keyframes by hitting J and K on the keyboard. So I'm just hopping between those keyframes that I have, hitting J and K and pulling all the points in to where they need to be. Just made sure that I had my layer locked so I wasn't going to accidentally move anything. Okay, so this shoulder needs to get pulled into place. By the way, I'd like to just make a little note here. If you look back here, this point that's off, I'm always going to pull that straight down. I'll never shift it laterally to fill in some other spot, because that's how you'll get some kind of chatter or little wiggling roto edges. So you always try to pull your points directly right down to the edge of the feature that you're rotoscoping. So I pull that straight down, and I just make a new point whenever I want to, and I make a new point by holding down Command and Command Option in After Effects 8. Okay, so I'm making a few new points here and there, as few as possible, of course. And I can control how linear they are relative to how curvy they are coming out of the point by holding down Command Option, which is Alt Control on a PC. And I'm just continuing to pull in points to get them conforming properly to the edge. And there's still a little bit more finessing we need to do to really make it hug the edge of the arm perfectly, and the way we're going to do that is by using the transform box. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Rather than using the J and K keys mostly now, I'm going to be using the page up and page down keys to see which in-between frames need to get adjusted. Like this, for example. That's this frame doesn't yet have a keyframe on it, so I'm going to set a keyframe on it. And if you look at the way I'm doing this with the transform box, I double-click my mask. That's what this symbol is, by the way, the double bullseye there. That means that I've double-clicked. And down here it looks okay, and up here it seems to be off a little bit, so I'm going to move my anchor point down to here and pivot the whole thing. And the more you can do that rather than moving individual points, the better, because it's going to also reduce chatter if you keep everything unified like that. So I'll move my anchor point down there and move my pivot up. That seems to have placed it pretty nicely. Okay, this one also needs the same kind of adjusting. And I'm just looking for the worst frames, always the worst frames in between. Because if I get those, the ones in between those frames that are left over, here you can see like these ones here, they may not necessarily need keyframes, so I'm looking always for the worst one in between, which usually ends up pretty close to the center here. So there'll be probably a bad one here, maybe a bad one here and here. I'm just moving things into place wherever I see it getting pretty bad. Just mostly finessing now. Now we're getting kind of into the home stretch here of getting the arm in shape. There's still a few points that don't seem to be quite right. So here I'm moving my anchor point. I'm just going to rotate it down a little bit just so it fits in there better. Again, using the anchor point and rotating it down, fixing that point up there doesn't seem to be quite in place. Obviously this needs to get stretched out because it's not quite the correct shape. And now we're kind of getting into the tedium of rotoscoping, which we're trying to keep to a minimum, of course, by using techniques like the 2-point track to transform our white solid before we do the rotoscoping on it. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. After the rotoscoping is done, it's time to add the shape to the matte comp. So there's a couple things you have to do to make that happen. By the way, that's what I mentioned earlier. I have my white solid accidentally within my tracker color correction comp, and I'm just switching it over to the correct comp, which is called right arm. Okay, and now there you can see I've got the roto shape turned on so you can actually see it in motion. So I'm going to turn off the skateboarder layer, and I'm going to drag this comp, right arm, into the matte comp. So this matte comp is just the one I'm using to build up all my shapes, adding to them bit by bit. So I've got the head, a little bit of his hood, the left arm, the torso, and the statue so far. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Okay, this is an example of the way not to rotoscope. I'm going to rotoscope the pants in this tutorial, and if you look here, I choose a couple of points along the pants and make my solid with the transform on it. And I'm going to have to add extra points in here along the bottom, and that's going to cause me problems because at the beginning they're together and then they're apart. So if you look later on here, what you end up with when the legs are apart, you've got all these points up here, all along here, that when the legs are closed, end up bunching up all down here, and you can't delete these points. Every point that you add has to stay in the roto shape. So the best way, or a better way, at least for sure, to do this is to roto this leg separate from this leg so that you don't run into this problem of having a whole bunch of extra points bunching up. This is too complex a shape for me to make with one roto shape. It should be at least divided into two. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Okay, so now I'm going to rotoscope the bench. And the first thing to do is to get a couple track points to help us with our roto. So I'm going to take track point 17 and 16 because they're far apart on the element that I'm trying to rotoscope. And copy and paste them onto the skateboard footage. And create a solid above it so that I can put the tracker data onto the red solid. Tracker 1, transform, all position, rotation, and scale. And I have to hit apply. There. I'm going to just check that my solid does have the transform of the rotation and scale and position put onto it, which it does, so that's good. And I'm going to get into the rotoscoping. I'm going to speed things up a little bit here. So we're actually looking now at 3 times normal speed, just so you don't have to watch me rotoscope in real time. It's a little bit slow. By the way, here I just did this shift because I started on frame 1, but on frame 1 his legs are kind of obscuring this area down here. So I'm going to start my roto on the last frame where I can see the bench better. That's why I've stopped and started with this transform box. I'm transforming because I switched from the first frame to the last frame around here. I realized, oh, I want to start on the last frame just because I can see the element more clearly. Just going to start adding points in. As few points as possible. Now I can pull out Bezier handles like that. The less points you have to move around, the better. In general. Especially with an item like this that doesn't really have very much chatter. Something with a lot of chatter like an arm that's moving around, I might want to put more points in for detail, but I should be able to get away with just a few of these big, broad Bezier points. There's a couple little spots like this that I've missed, but I'll come back to them. Add in any extra points that I have missed. Now I've switched to frame 1, and with the transform box I'm going to try to get it as close as I can. Since there's a track point here and a track point here, there's not a lot of problem in those 2 areas, and as you get closer to the center you can see things slip off more. So now I've turned on my red solid layer so that I can grab groups of points if I want to in order to do small transforms of just a specific group of points, and I can't do that unless the layer is actually turned on. Here I'm just doing these by hand. There, I grabbed it with a transform box, or with a marquee box I should say, just a small group of points, and I move them. The disadvantage is that you don't get your RAM preview, but since we're just working on 1 frame at the moment, it doesn't really matter to see a RAM preview. And this is probably only going to need very few keyframes in all anyway. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Need to start making some of the negative space mask shapes for the inside of the bench. So I'm going to go along and do a few of these. And I'm just making these all linear to begin with, just because I find it's a little quicker to work that way. And then I'm going to switch them all to Bezier afterward. So just click, click, click through very quickly. All linear, like this. There I was using the keyboard to move that point. I used one of the arrow keys. I have to make sure that I turn my keyframing on for the mask shape, otherwise I might end up doing extra work. Alright, so now I'm option clicking, then option command clicking, which would be alt clicking and then alt control clicking. And that allows me to select all points on a certain mask and then change it to curvy Bezier. Now I've got to move them in to position on the keyframe that's at the opposite end of the footage. And I have to change these all to subtract, which I can do all at once, like that. Change this to a color that's more suited to the comp we're putting together. I'll have a look through this, see if there's anything that's sticking out as being a big problem. And I don't see anything too bad, so now I can have a look at it. I'll just put this at normal playback speed. Yeah, so that looks good. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. To rotoscope the left arm, I'm going to stabilize the footage rather than stabilizing the solid. And I'll just show you here. I had a couple track points which I had to, for the most part, hand track just to get them in to position. This I just tracked this little bend in his shirt there, and a lot of it was kind of inventive. You have to just, when it's moving around so much like this, a lot of times you just have to place things just so. And it's better to take your time with this hand tracking to get a good track. See, there's a bit of swimming happening there. It's better to take your time with this hand tracking and get it really good so that when you apply it to your solid, or in this case when you apply it to the footage, you get something very, very stabilized. So I don't mind spending an extra 5 minutes hand tracking it, because I know if I get these 2 points in place, it's going to help all the other points to conform better to the arm. Okay, so now I've put both of the trackers into one tracker. They were both in two separate trackers, tracker 1 and tracker 2. I copied and pasted the second tracker into the first tracker so that After Effects can understand that it's possible to stabilize with position, rotation, and scale, for which you need 2 points. Okay, so they're both in tracker 1 now, point 1 and point 2, making sure I'm on the very first frame when I'm copying and pasting. And I'm going to apply the tracker data to the footage itself. So I'm going to stabilize rather than transform. Go back here a little bit. Normally, I choose transform when I'm applying it to a different layer. Now that I'm applying it to the same layer to stabilize it, I choose stabilize. And that's going to kind of create a pretty weird effect, but the great advantage of this is that the arm doesn't move. Even when you zoom in pretty close like this, the arm is always centered in your window. You don't have to use the space bar to use the hand tool to move things around, because this is completely, well, not completely, but more or less stationary in the window. And now you make a solid above, which you don't apply the transform, position, rotation, and scale to. It's just stationary, and you start rotoscoping on the arm. So I'm just going to make my 4-point roto shape and make sure that I have keyframing on, and go to a bad frame and start fixing things up. just speed things up. Now we're going to look at it at 3 times actual speed. And since I have everything in RAM preview, I can scrub through really quickly and see where my problems are. And I just look for the worst frame in between. That's what I'm always doing, just looking for the worst frame. And I'm going to get a few frames here, maybe 10 or 12 of the worst ones, and keep finessing them until it hugs his arm nicely. There's quite a few things to correct here still. And I want to keep the points as close to always the same as possible. For example, this point up here should always be the top of his shoulder. This point here should always be just coming around the end of his shoulder. I try to keep them quite consistent. That makes sure that the amount of swimming and the amount of jitter that happens in your Rotoshape is kept to a minimum. Now I'm just hopping through J and K in order to get these main keyframes in order. There's quite a bit of correction yet to do. Now I'm scrubbing through the timeline looking for the worst frame in between. Always the worst one. There's the worst one right there. So I fix that, and hopefully that's going to allow the total number of keyframes to be less than it otherwise would. Just always scrubbing back and forth through. Sometimes I use the page up and page down to scrub back and forth through as well. Sometimes using the arrow keys can give you, well, in this case it works quite well to use the arrow keys because you have the tracker data applied to the footage. When you have the tracker data applied to the solid itself, sometimes when you hit the right arrow, you'll end up having your point go up because of the rotation that's placed on it. Now I'm making everything Roto Bezier, by the way. I'll just go back to that here just so you see. I chose that. Here we are. Roto Bezier. And that just allows everything to take a curve, a Bezier type curve, without having Bezier handles to get in the way, because I don't really use the handles very much, except for very, very easy rotoscoping. But this kind of rotoscoping, which is changing quite a bit from frame to frame, I'd rather use Roto Bezier in most cases, just because it gets the Bezier handles out of the way, and I'm able to grab in between 2 points and pull 2 points together, which I'm going to be doing a little bit. I'm sure I'll point that out to you when I do that here. So now I'm just hopping between the keyframes, the main keyframes, and getting them all to conform properly to the arm. And once I get them in, I'm going to, there, I'm using the up and down arrow keys, by the way. You can see, to get this stuff into position. I'm double clicking the shape in order to get the transform box. I'm offsetting the anchor point to a part of the roto shape that looks good, and the part where it's the worst is the furthest from the anchor point. When I'm using the transform box here, I'm just scrubbing through to look for the worst frame. That's a pretty bad frame. I'll bring that one in. There's so much little motion in the arm here from frame to frame that I'm going to need a keyframe on almost every frame. Pull these in. There's still a little bit to do on the upper part of the arm there as well. I'm just using J and K to fix the keyframes that I've made so far. We're getting close. Anything that looks like chatter I want to try and get rid of as best I can. Now I'm using J and K again to go only through the keyframes I've made. Notice here that I was pulling in between. Here, I'm pulling in between. That's very handy to pull 2 points together that have the same amount of offset from where you want them to be, which you can only do in linear or roto Bezier, but not in the normal Bezier. If you use the normal Bezier that has handles and you do that, you end up pulling the curve out. Okay, so now we've got the basic roto shape, and we now need to apply the inversion to the rotoshape so that it conforms to the original footage rather than this transformed footage. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Okay, so now it's time to take our roto and invert it so that it doesn't fit along this transformed footage, but rather along the original footage. So we'll bring in a copy of the skateboarder. We'll call this one Original. And we'll make a new solid which will have expressions on it. An expression between the between the skateboarder 03. So there's going to be an expression between this layer and the solid _exp. So anchor point gets expressed. I'll just slow down here a little bit. Anchor point gets expressed to position. And position gets an expression with anchor point. And the scale, I always pick whip it to the first of these two percentages here, which gives me an expression that looks like this. And in here I just write 10,000 over and 10,000 over, and that gives me the opposite relative to 100% of whatever number this is. So the amount it takes this number to return to 100% is this number, which causes it to fit back to the original shape of the footage. And the rotation times -1. So whatever amount it rotated one way, it's rotating the other way. So this is the full expression that you need to write, or the full group of expressions that you need to write. Okay, so now it's time to check it out. There's still a couple little things that need to get done here on a few of the frames that I didn't catch before. These pieces need to go in here. These roto vertices, I should say. And the last little tweaks. Scrubbing through to see if there's any extra points that need to get put into position. A few up top there that aren't quite on as they should be. And down in the armpit here, there's a few that need to get moved around. Okay, so let's have a look at this in motion. So there you have the roto of the left arm. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. In this tutorial, I'm going to rotoscope the right hand of the skateboarder. I've got a couple track points that I got from my Track This comp. And I'm going to create a solid above, as usual. Connect it to a transform track, 2-point track. That's transforming the position, rotation, and scale. And you can see here there's a problem. It's scaling up so big that there's going to be distortion that we don't want, which I'll just scrub through a bit here. I have an example. If you look along here, there's a bunch of very bad distortion happening around the whole image, and that's because it's so big relative to the full size of the comp. This is the full comp, and this is the solid layer that's being transformed by the position, rotation, and scale. So that's no good. So there's something we can do to fix that, which is to make a second solid above the first solid with an expression between the second solid and the first solid. Adjusting the scale relative to the first solid. So that I'm going to make an expression here, and I'll take the scale and I'm going to divide by 3 or possibly 4. And the position and rotation, I'm going to also make a direct expression between those properties so that the new gray solid is the same as the old gray solid except smaller. And there you can see if I turn off the old gray solid that the new gray solid doesn't get nearly as big as the old gray solid. And as long as it doesn't scale over 100% roughly, it should be fine. You should be able to use this, and you won't get that nasty distortion on the edge of your roto shapes when you do it this way. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. And once we've got the gray solid that's been scaled down, ready to go, the process of rotoscoping the hand is much the same as I did with the left arm. Pardon me, the right arm. So I'll play through it a couple times. Speed it up a little bit here. And make a few points to rough in the shape and scrub through to see how it looks. So basically it's following the movement of the hand more or less. At the end it's getting a little bit bigger than it should in a lot of spots. And it's just a matter of starting to refine the shape. So I'll speed this up a little bit more. I can use the transform box to do some refining. And I'm always looking for the worst frame every time. Whenever I see a very bad frame, that's where I want to set my keyframe. Probably going to end up with 10 or 12 because it's a pretty complex shape. Moving these in. And once I get these points pretty much as I'd like them to be, I'm going to also change this into a Roto Bezier shape. It's a little bit more refining that needs to get done. Here I'm Option Command clicking in order to pull out the points to make them curvy, to make each point have a Roto Bezier curve rather than be linear. And I'm hitting J and K to only hop between the keyframes that I've already made. And now I'm going to go through and add a couple extra points in where I need to. And wherever I add a new point, I hop through the J and K keys to push that point into place on all of my keyframes. And keep refining it. Using J and K again, and keep moving in until everything fits right into place. Only on the keyframes. Once I've got my keyframes to a good level, then I'm going to have a look in between to see if there's any skipping and start adding in just like that. Now I'm scrubbing through all the frames to see where there's any problems and just looking for the worst frame and trying to put a keyframe on that. Sometimes I'll use the transform box so it looks like everything can get adjusted, which is often the case for the last little finessing. Okay. These points need to get pulled out. Now it's just the detailed work of pulling everything into place. Okay, so the roto shape is made now. I just need to adjust the color to be the same as the arm. And I'm going to incorporate that into my main comp. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. In this tutorial, I'm going to be rotoscoping the building in the background. And so I start by making a new comp from my footage. And I'm going to rename the comp to building. I need to find a couple track points, so I'm going to take track point 2 and track point 1 and copy and paste them. And by the way, if you have this preference set here, I'll just go back a little bit. If you have all keyframes are no more than 5 or no more than a certain amount of time, you're going to get lines that look like this all over the place. And I tend to turn that off when I'm tracking because it gets in the way, and you can actually accidentally move these points if you drag them. So make sure that that's set to no motion path in your preferences. Okay, so I'm going to take track points 1 and 2, copy and paste them into the building comp onto the footage layer. And my 2 track points, making sure that I'm at frame 1. Make a solid, put it on top, and apply the tracker data, position, rotation, and scale to the building as usual. Make sure you have the correct tracker selected. There's only one you can possibly select, but you actually have to explicitly choose it. Okay, so now the layer, the red solid layer, has taken the position, rotation, and scale transforms of the 2-point track down here. But there's a problem because it's not covering the whole building. In many cases, the item that you're trying to rotoscope will be fully covered in the layer, but in this case it isn't, so we have to do a little workaround to make sure that it is fully covering it. So what I'm going to do is make a second solid and make expressions between the first solid and the second solid and do a rotation offset. So I'll give my second layer a different color, turn its opacity down as well so we can see what we're doing. And I'm going to make expressions between the position, scale, and rotation of the green solid and the red solid. And in the rotation expression, I'm going to subtract the amount that it is rotated by, more or less. And it's still off a little bit, so I'm actually using the anchor point now. Notice I'm not changing position on screen, I'm just changing the anchor point position. And I'm going to have a look through all my frames, and I can see on the last frame here it's still offset a little bit too much, or it's not offset enough, I should say. So I'm going to move the anchor point a little bit more until it completely covers the building. Okay, so now that works. And I'm going to do my rotoscoping on my green solid rather than my red solid, because that's the one that's fully covering the element of the footage that I'm interested in, which is what we're going to do next. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. Okay, so now that we have the 2-point tracker data applied to the green solid with the rotation offset, we're ready to start rotoscoping the building. This, by the way, is playing back at 3 times actual speed. I don't rotoscope this fast. By the way, here I just want to mention one maneuver I do that I find saves a lot of time. I'm making a point along the path here by holding down Command Option on After Effects 8 and just Command on anything before that, After Effects 7 and before. And then I move it into position still as a linear keyframe, and then I hit Command Option again and I click it, and it makes it Bezier, it makes it curved like that. Command Option, by the way, is Control Alt on a PC. And in this way I find I can save a lot of time when I'm positioning new keyframes here and there, and I'm going to do the same thing for that point. And I'm just roughing in the rest of the shape here, doing the same for that point. And getting down the edge of this grass underneath here. Okay, so that looks pretty good on the first frame. I've got to fill this in here. Now I'm going to hop. I'm going to make sure that I have keyframing on and hop to the last frame. And there's a little bit of an offset here, so I'm going to use the transform box, see if I can make it fit any better, and I can't quite, so there's going to be a bit of movement of points around here and there. And here I'm just shift clicking a group of points at a time. So I'll take, for example, this point, and I'll start shift clicking my way down until I've got all the points that I want to move as a group. Changing the color of the mask so that I can see a little bit better. I'm going to select all these keyframes and move them as a group again. And fix this out at the end here. So now I can have a look to see if I got it. I'm going to have a look up close to make sure that my track isn't slipping anywhere and fix any few mask vertices that need to be repaired. And here we'll play back this at normal speed so we can see it a little bit better. So it looks like something's slipping off there. It looks like this last keyframe can get adjusted, so I'm going to move that up and this one up. That as well. I'll play through it one more time. So that's holding on very well to the edge of that building. Speed things back up here a little bit. And do the last little bit of finessing that needs to be done to bring the last few vertices of the mask into the edge of the element that I'm rotoscoping. And I'm going to choose a more useful color for my main comp, which is whites and off-whites. In fact, this is going to end up being quite a dark color because it's going to be in the deep background. So there we have the building element rotoscoped and ready to be incorporated into the main matte comp. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. If a two-point track is helpful when rotoscoping, then why not a four-point corner pin track as well? It took me a while to figure out how to implement this correctly in After Effects, but I finally did. So this is one way, or possibly maybe the only way, that I configure that you can actually do a four-point rotoscoping, four-point track with rotoscoping in After Effects. So here I'm going to track this, the side of this statue here, the 4 points of the statue, which is a pretty easy track, in order to demonstrate how you can use this tracker data to apply to a rotoshape. They're hanging on as they should. And now I have an animation preset here which is made up of 3 effects. I'll just show you here. I've got a CC power pin and 2 sliders from the expression controls. Pull down. Okay, and in here I've got SX and SY, which are this part of the expression here, which I'm going to go through now, how I built this expression. And to do that, I'm just going to add the CC power pin to a layer. This is a new comp. And I'm going to pull it into the 4 points that I'm interested in here. Pull this one down to the bottom, actually. Okay, so those are the 4 corners I'm interested in. And if I turn on CC power pin and I click unstretch on, that makes the 4 points that I chose get pulled out to the 4 corners of the comp, which is basically what I want. But I also want them to be pulled in so that I can rotoscope. If you look back here, when they're pulled out to the edge, I can't rotoscope this edge in here. There's a whole bunch of detail over here on this side of the line that I can't actually get at. There's no way for me to get at that in After Effects since it's outside the bounds of the comp. Okay, so what I want to do is pull them in, but I can't just pull them in as I'm doing here. I need them to be applied through an expression with a specific amount of offset that stays consistent through the entire duration of the comp. And I'm going to do that with that SX and XY expression. So I'll go to Effect, make a second instance of the corner of the power pin, and make an expression between the first and the second one, so that the second one is controlled by the first one. And I need to add 2 instances of slider control, which I'm going to put into this expression up here as an offset, SX and SY. So in the first one, I'll say plus SX, comma SY. And so basically what we're saying here is we've got a point, which is a 2-dimensional point in the comp, which is this effect CC power pin top left. That's an array, a 2-dimensional array, plus this 2-dimensional array, which is going to be controlled by these 2 sliders down here. And I'm going to get an error here, because what I'm going to now is I'm going to pick whip from here to the first slider after I've selected SX. And that's going to be okay. And a second error until I pick whip, select this and pick whip it down to the second slider. Yeah. This is plus this array, but this array needs to be, the individual elements in this one need to be negative. So negative slider to pull it down. That's basically in order to pull it from the top corner down in. This one needs to be plus minus, this one needs to be minus plus, and the last one can be plus plus in both cases. And what that does is allow me to move these sliders, and I'm going to click this to unstretch. When I move these sliders in, I'll just zero them out again so you can see. I'm able to see the entire element that I'm about to rotoscope, including this area down in here that was before it was off screen. So now it's been offset inward a little bit, just enough so that I can see the whole element through the entire duration of the footage in my comp. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. So rather than write that expression out every time, I've just made a little effects favorite, which includes the CC power pin, the SX and SY. And so I'm making it a solid as usual on top of my footage, and I'm going to apply CC power pin, a new instance of CC power pin to the solid, and I'm going to make an expression between this power pin and this power pin, just as I did in the example of how to connect the power pin with the offset SX SY. So I'm going to pick whip these to the corresponding properties of the CC power pin and the motion trackers of the footage. And you can see here that it's basically following the shape of the side of the statue. Keep in mind that these 4 corners actually correspond to the 4 corners of the comp. So this red square, which was as large as the comp, is the 4 corners are getting forced in here. Now I can't rotoscope with a mask as I normally would using position, rotation, and scaling keyframes. It won't scale in because this is an effect and this is calculated after masks. So that's one of the big problems, or one of the reasons why we need to do this workaround that we're about to do in order to be able to rotoscope this element properly. So I'm going to turn on the unstretch button. Make sure that's on so that the element you have kind of stretches out to almost fit the full frame, minus whatever amounts this SX and SY values are. In this case it's 20 and 80, I believe, to pull these edges in. as we did when I was explaining how the expression worked for the CC power pin. So I'm creating a basic shape and find a better color than that so it stands out a little better. And I'm just going to rough in the shape of the statue here. And this is all on frame 1. Now if I go to the last frame, you see there's a bit of an offset. Everything's not quite in position. So I'm going to bring it into position and using the transform box, transform everything as best I can before I start moving individual points, just to finesse everything into the correct position. Okay. So notice my roto shape is as big as this because this whole area is getting unstretched out to this size, which actually is quite convenient because since it's so big I can see all the details of all the corners very clearly of the object that I'm rotoscoping. And when I play through it, I'll just move this to normal playback speed so we can see it in motion here. With just a keyframe at the beginning and end, I've got a pretty rock solid rotoscope of the side of this statue. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. You can save your roto elements out as FFX presets. And the way to do that would be to select all your masks, basically anything that has a keyframe. And position, scale, and rotation. So making sure you've got all that selected. You then drag it into the Effects and Presets window, which allows you to save it as a preset. So I'm going to save this as skb_bench. Alright, so let's say someone else is working on this comp and they need the bench roto element. And they've started a new comp. They make a solid as usual on top. And in the Effects and Presets palette, they would type in the word, let's say, bench. Whoops. That space at the beginning didn't find it. Okay, so it's SKB bench. So they found the element they were looking for. I just drag it on top here, and there's the bench element. With all the keyframes for position, scale, and rotation, and all the keyframes for the masks. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. There's lots of different effects you can do once you're done with your roto, and the first one I'm going to demonstrate is how to incorporate a CG element between foreground elements in your footage and background elements. So in this example, I have the cow logo perspective corner pinned up onto the building. And I'm going to just redo this whole comp to show you how I did that. I'll just show the individual layers here so you have an idea. Foreground element, another foreground element there, the skateboarder. Okay, so I'm just going to delete all this and bring the cow footage, or the cow layer, back in, which is called Cow Alone. It's this one here. Right. Now this layer called Track This is actually the footage with 4 track points on it. I'll show you those. So these are tracked along 4 points in the footage. So if I come back into my main comp and I select track this, and I look at my tracker controls and set the track type to perspective corner pin and make sure my target is cow alone, I can hit apply. So what I'm going to do is take this cow alone layer and add another instance of the corner pin effect to it, making sure that the new instance is above. So the one without the keyframe should be above the one that does have keyframes on it. And these 4 points are the 4 points of the first corner pin, the one without the keyframes. So I can move these into position until I get something that looks pretty much like it's in the correct perspective. Okay, that feels about right. And there's a few things I want to do to this right off the bat. First is to color correct it with curves. Something like that. Maybe just a little brighter. Okay, that looks good. And I'm also going to add an instance of a drop shadow effect. Maybe make this distance about 18, soften it up, put it down like that. Let's have a look at this. It's a bit too far. Okay, something like that, just to give it a bit of depth. And we'll play through this now. Okay, so now what we have to do is take the foreground elements that are in front of the sign, which is this lamp and the skateboarder, and isolate them in front. So I'll go back to the project window. And we have to bring in a couple of the mats from the pieces folder. Lamp behind bench, and also skateboarder. I'm going to hit Option Home to bring those back to frame 1 and turn both of their visibilities off. Then take the footage and put it underneath each of those mats. Whoops. Okay. The track mat in both cases should be set to alpha mat on the skateboarder footage layer, so that pops the lamp and the skateboarder in front. So there's an example of how to use rotoscoping to incorporate a CG element between foreground and background elements in your footage. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. I can also use the roto I've created for a fog effect, as in this example. Just show you before and after. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this fog and we'll build it back from scratch. So we'll go Layer, New, Solid, and notice that my solid here, which I'll name Fog, the solid size is bigger than the comp size. The comp size is 1920 by 1080, and I want this to be 2500 by 1500, just to give it a bit of breathing room once it's tracked in. And I also need to go get the main matte comp, bring that in over top. And on this fog layer, I'm going to apply a fractal noise effect. And I'll make that a little bit bigger. And give it some evolution keyframing. So now we have a general fractal noise that looks something like that. And the matte here needs to get used as the track matte for the fog layer. So I'll say Luma matte. That's not right. Luma inverted matte. And we'll turn the opacity of this down considerably. And now we've got the beginning of our fog effect. But there's one main problem with this, which is that since the camera is moving and the buildings are moving towards the right, the fog is not tracked in with that. So we need to sync it up with the buildings. We'll play through that here once so you can see. See how the fractal noise is not moving along with the movement of the camera. So on my skateboarder layer, I have a couple of track points along the back building. And I'm going to use those to track in the fog properly. Okay, so I'll go to my tracker controls, select the skateboard layer that has the motion trackers on it, tracker type, transform, position, rotation, and scale, that's good. Edit target, I want that to be fog. I'll look at these motion trackers, they look good. One tracker with 2 points. And click apply. Now we're looking at the layer here. We have to look at the comp, which is over here. And of course, because of the position, rotation, and scale transforms that we've applied, it doesn't fit quite properly. So I'm going to bring up the anchor point, try moving that around. Oh, I have 2 layers selected, so I'll deselect and just move this one layer down like this, and it still doesn't quite fit. So what I'm going to do is apply an instance of the transform effect and put a bit of rotation on that. That should do the trick. So now it should cover it for the whole duration of the footage. So I think that the effect is a little bit too intense, so I'm going to bring it down to 8% and see how that looks. Turn off the on-screen controls with Shift Command H or Shift Control H on a PC. That feels about right, and I think I'll also blur it a little bit. And maybe bring its opacity up to 10. And we'll play through that to see what it looks like. So now the fog is properly tracked in with the footage, and I'll just do a little before and after here. And so there you have an example of using rotoscoping to create a fog effect. Hi, this is Pete O'Connell for CreativeCow.net. And last but not least, I'm going to be applying a lens blur effect to the footage using the roto as a depth matte layer. So this is the kind of effect we're going to create. And so I'll just get rid of the matte and we'll start from scratch here. So there's our skateboarder footage. And I'm going to take the matte in, drag it underneath, select the skateboarder, go to Effect, Blur, Lens Blur, and that defaults to a kind of a moderate overall blur. So the depth map layer, I need to change that to matte, and it's not going to quite look right here because the blur focal distance is incorrect. And for the blur focal distance, 0 corresponds to black and 1 corresponds to white in this image. So according to the settings we now have in the lens blur effect, This is fully in focus, and as things move towards white, they get more and more out of focus. But we actually want the skateboarder himself to be in focus, and if we look here at the info palette, you can see his values are at 0.78. And by the way, you have to make sure you're set to decimal here. So since the skateboarder is 0.78, we need to change the blur focal distance to 0.78. And we'll turn the matte layer off and turn the skateboarder back on, and now it works as it should. Just take a picture of that. Yeah, that's looking good, and I'll just do a RAM preview so we can have a look at this. So that's an example of using rotoscoping to create a depth map controlled lens blur effect.